In 1941, at the very height of World War II, the Soviet Union found itself standing alone against the massive onslaught of Nazi Germany and its numerous satellites. Although the Allies were already engaged in combat operations against the Reich, the Red Army was the only force fighting the Germans on land across the European continent. To drastically reduce the pressure on the Eastern Front, the Soviet leadership insistently demanded the urgent opening of a second front. For a long time, the Allies provided the Soviet Union with only material assistance under the Lend-Lease program. In early September 1941, Stalin wrote frankly to British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, "The USSR faces mortal danger and asks for a second front this very year, in the Balkans or France, to draw away at least 30 to 40 German divisions." At that point, the United States had not yet entered the war against Germany. Although Churchill admitted that the full weight of the war lay on Russia's shoulders, he refused to land British troops in Europe. Negotiations continued. During the Second Moscow Conference, Churchill again told Stalin that opening a second front in 1942 was simply impossible. This was a very difficult moment for the Allies. The Germans were winning in Africa, while the Red Army was retreating from Rostov-on-Don and losing positions in the Caucasus. Fierce battles raged at Azov and Stalingrad. Arriving at the Kremlin, Churchill still wouldn't promise a second front before 1943, citing a lack of forces and poor weather. Churchill claimed the English Channel was impassable due to conditions. The Soviet leader responded with sharp reproaches, accusing the Allies of indecision. To reassure him, Churchill promised they would land in North Africa and conduct a reconnaissance in force in France. Days later, British troops landed at the French city of Dieppe. The attempt to seize the port failed. The landing force was completely destroyed in a brief, bloody battle. This bitter experience showed the Allied command that any future landing required massive support from heavy warships and aircraft. At Dieppe, only destroyers were sent, and their guns couldn't damage the German coastal defenses. Stalin did not consider the North African landings to be a true second front. The German Afrika Korps was an isolated group that didn't affect the decisive operations on the Eastern Front. After defeating Rommel, Roosevelt and Churchill decided to invade Sicily to control the Mediterranean and strike Italy, Hitler's main ally. Although the war in Italy diverted 1 million German soldiers, the Kremlin still didn't see it as the required second front. US General George Marshall agreed, viewing the Mediterranean as secondary to the main goal, a cross-channel thrust into northern France. Finally, at the Tehran Conference in late 1943, the Allies gave their firm word. The United States President even had to warn Churchill directly. If the British refused the 1944 landing, the Americans would withdraw their troops from England and move their idle landing craft to the Pacific Theater. The massive operation to land Allied forces in northern France received the code name Overlord, while the actual naval assault on the Normandy beaches was designated as Operation Neptune. The development of this complex invasion plan was entrusted to British General Frederick Morgan. Many prominent commanders, such as Montgomery and Bradley, were recalled from the Italian front, which had now become secondary, to prepare the troops in England for the future landing. Simultaneously, vast numbers of American troops were being transported across the Atlantic to the British Isles, where they immediately began intensive combat training. The most difficult challenge for the Allied command was choosing the exact location for the landing. Properly supplying a massive invasion force required a large port with functional docks, but every single port on the Atlantic coast had been transformed by the Germans into an almost impregnable fortress. The success of the entire operation depended on how quickly they could build up infantry and tank strength on a captured bridgehead. An extraordinary yet necessary solution was proposed by John Hughes Hallett, the naval commander of the Dieppe raid. If we cannot capture a port, then we must bring one with us. It was decided to seize a bridgehead away from established ports and create an artificial harbour using reinforced concrete. These massive piers and breakwaters, codenamed Mulberry, were built as hollow structures to be towed across the channel. To hide their true plans, the British government, at the insistence of the United States, imposed a strict security regime in the coastal areas of southern England where the invasion troops were stationed. By early June 1944, the German command had nearly 900,000 men available in France, Belgium, and Holland. In theory, they represented a significant force, but these units were scattered over a very vast geographic area. This dispersion meant the Allies could easily create local superiority at any chosen point of the landing. There were fierce arguments among German commanders regarding the best strategy to repel the invasion. Erwin Rommel, who had significant experience fighting the Allies, believed the success of the landing would be decided within the first 24 hours. He advocated for a powerful defense directly on the coastline using tank units. In the end, Hitler made a compromise. Rommel received 3 tank divisions, Rundstedt got 3, and 4 others remained in the High Command Reserve. A major obstacle to both plans was that many German mobile units in Normandy had recently been moved from the Eastern Front for refitting and had lost much of their combat effectiveness. However, the worst factor for the Germans was the overwhelming disparity in air power. In the end, Hitler made a compromise. Rommel received 3 tank divisions, Rundstedt got 3, and 4 others remained in the High Command Reserve. A major obstacle to both plans was that many German mobile units in Normandy had recently been moved from the Eastern Front for refitting and had lost much of their combat effectiveness. However, the worst factor for the Germans was the overwhelming disparity in air power. The Luftwaffe's 3rd Air Fleet had only about 500 aircraft at its disposal, while the Allies could oppose them with more than 7,000 combat machines. The landing in Normandy was preceded by a massive, weeks-long aerial offensive designed to cause a total collapse of the enemy's transportation system. The Germans placed some hope on the Atlantic Wall, a line of coastal fortifications under construction since 1942. However, the Germans primarily fortified existing ports and their surrounding areas. This meant the Allied plan to use artificial harbours allowed them to strike at the least defended positions. In addition to bunkers on the shore, the Germans built underwater obstacles like steel hedgehogs and concrete pyramids to tear the hulls of landing craft. Consequently, the Allied command decided to land at low tide when these traps were visible. Combat engineers were tasked with detonating these obstacles to clear a path before the tide rose. The original date for the invasion was set for June 5, 1944, but on the morning of the 4th, the operation was delayed by 24 hours due to worsening weather. On that evening, General Eisenhower made the final decision to launch the invasion on Tuesday, June 6th, taking a gamble on a brief break in the storms. A seemingly minor factor worked in the Allies' favour. They had previously pushed German weather stations out of the North Atlantic. As a result, the Germans were unaware of the incoming window of better weather. Confident that no landing was possible in such a storm, Erwin Rommel looked at the forecast and left for a family vacation. On June 6, 1944, the largest naval invasion in world history finally began. Just minutes after midnight, the operation started with a massive airborne drop. The American 82nd and 101st Divisions, along with the British 6th Airborne, landed in Normandy. The paratroopers managed to avoid many coastal obstacles by landing further inland. Although many units were scattered over a wide area due to poor visibility and navigation errors, they ultimately achieved their primary objectives. They captured several vital bridges and demolished others to prevent German reinforcements from reaching the landing zones. At 3 a.m., the coastline was struck by 2,000 British and American heavy bombers. This was followed at 5:25 a.m. by a powerful naval bombardment from the Allied fleet. It seemed as though nothing could survive the hail of heavy shells raining down on the German defensive positions. At exactly 6:30 a.m., the first waves of infantry began disembarking from the landing craft. They were immediately met by a devastating wall of machine gun and artillery fire. The first wave was supposed to be supported by specialized Sherman DD amphibious tanks, equipped with waterproof screens and propellers. This leads to a natural question. Why did the disaster at Omaha Beach, so famously depicted by Spielberg, actually happen? At Omaha, the tanks were launched into the water far too far from the shore. The heavy waves swamped them, and they began to sink almost instantly. As a result, more than half of the amphibious tanks intended to support the main American landing at Omaha went to the bottom before ever reaching land. The few tanks that did make it to the beach provided invaluable assistance to the pinned-down infantry by targeting German nests. These surviving tanks began systematically destroying German machine gun nests, but they soon came under intense fire from anti-tank guns positioned in concrete bunkers. The situation was saved by Allied destroyers that braved the shallow waters to approach the shore. Under their direct and heavy fire, the German bunkers began to fall silent one by one. Even though the initial crisis on Omaha Beach was eventually overcome, the atmosphere remained extremely tense. Special demolition teams, tasked with blowing up the underwater hedgehogs and pyramids, suffered heavy casualties. As a result, they managed to clear only a few narrow corridors through the obstacle system. The Allied command had expected that Omaha would be defended by second-rate units, unaware that the veteran 352nd Infantry Division of the Wehrmacht, which included many survivors of the Eastern Front, was stationed right there. Following the first wave, more transport and landing ships arrived at Omaha, unloading reinforcements and heavy equipment under a hurricane of fire. Many vessels were hit, bursting into flames and sinking to the bottom. Nevertheless, by the end of the day, the Americans managed to secure the beachhead and begin a large-scale offloading process. A total of 34,000 troops landed at Omaha, but it came at a staggering cost for the US 5th Corps. The capture of this sector cost 4,700 soldiers and officers, along with 60 ships and boats, 50 tanks, and 26 artillery pieces. However, almost everywhere else except for the bloodbath at Omaha, the Germans failed to offer significant resistance. The American landing at the second sector, codenamed Juno, went relatively smoothly. Juno was located at the base of the Cotentin Peninsula and was much more lightly fortified by the Germans. The Germans believed that landing on Ruhr Peninsula and then trying to break out onto the mainland was pointless. However, this sector was vital for securing the flank and connecting with the airborne troops. Only about one German company defended Juno, and the amphibious tanks that crawled out of the water quickly silenced the machine gun nests. American losses here were around 200 men, while the British and Canadian landings at Gold, Juno, and Sword were even more successful. By midday on June 6th, ships began towing the Mulberry artificial harbour components toward the landing zones. Construction of the man-made ports began directly on the sand, which allowed for the continuous supply of a massive group of forces, including heavy tanks and artillery. By the end of D-Day, 156,000 men and several thousand pieces of equipment, including 500 tanks, had been successfully landed on the coast of France. The second front in Europe was now officially open. During the initial landing phase, total Allied casualties amounted to approximately 10,000 men. German losses, according to various estimates, ranged from 4,000 to 9,000 soldiers and officers. When Hitler first learned of the landing, he was in no hurry to release his strategic reserves. He still firmly believed that the main Allied invasion would actually take place at the port of Calais. This strategic blunder would later cost the Germans dearly. By June 18th, the Allies had successfully blocked German units on the Cotentin Peninsula, and by the 22nd, they captured the strategically vital port of Cherbourg. However, the invasion was still falling behind its original schedule. One of the main goals for the first day at the Sword sector was the city of Caen, a major road junction, but it could not be captured in the initial rush. The advancing Canadians were met by a fierce counterattack from the 21st Panzer Division. The battle for Caen would become the epicenter of military actions for the next month and a half. Allied heavy bombers mercilessly pounded the city from the air, but success remained elusive. After a short operational pause, the Germans tried to crush the beachhead, but they lacked the necessary strength to drive the Allies back into the sea. Part of the reason for this was that the German command had been forced to move the 2nd SS Panzer Corps from France to Ukraine earlier in April. However, Allied attempts to break out of the bridgehead also met with failure at first. By the summer of 1944, the Germans had mass-produced heavy Tiger tanks and the medium Panther, which proved to be formidable opponents on the battlefield. On June 15th, when British forces tried to break into open ground, they encountered heavy tanks of the 101st SS Panzer Battalion in the village of Bocage. The German Tigers led a devastating slaughter of British tanks in the narrow streets. Every offensive operation in the British sector was met by the lethal fire of these new German tanks, along with anti-tank guns and flak batteries. The armor of all Allied tanks was consistently penetrated by the powerful German guns. The Allies relied on heavy bombers to strike German cities, rail stations, and bridges, but these planes were poorly suited for precision bombing of individual frontline positions. Ultimately, the Allies succeeded only in isolating the theater of war by destroying all major bridges and railway hubs throughout the Normandy region. Despite the destruction of infrastructure, German combat units moved effectively at night, and their frontline positions remained difficult to break. To make matters worse, the Americans and British faced a serious obstacle in the Bocages, ancient earthen embankments with thick hedges that divided French fields. Tanks frequently got stuck in them, and the spectre of World War I-style trench warfare began to haunt the command. The Allies desperately wanted to avoid a stalemate. The turning point in the Battle of Normandy came only in late July 1944, once the American sector had accumulated enough forces. At the same time, the Germans focused their main efforts on holding Caen. This strategic focus finally allowed the Allies to deliver a crushing blow and break out into the open operational space. The American tanks of General Patton's Third Army struck south before turning sharply east, beginning the encirclement of a large German group near Falaise. As a result, nearly 50,000 Wehrmacht soldiers were taken prisoner. This monumental success would have been impossible without the vital intelligence provided by British cryptographers who had cracked the German Enigma codes. Allied intelligence was reading German radio messages almost faster than the commanders for whom they were intended. Patton knew exactly where the gaps in the enemy line were and boldly turned his back to empty areas confirmed by the maps. Consequently, the German defense was shattered instantly. The destruction of the Germans in the Falaise Pocket marked the end of the Battle for Normandy. The Wehrmacht had suffered a catastrophic defeat. By August 25th, the Allies had reached the Seine, liberated Paris, and occupied all of northwestern France. The long-awaited road to Germany was finally open. The combined efforts of the Allied forces had turned the tide of the war in the West, ensuring that the liberation of Europe was now only a matter of time. The success of Overlord was the result of unprecedented coordination between naval, air, and land forces. Despite the heavy losses on beaches like Omaha, the bravery of the soldiers and the ingenuity of the planners allowed the Allies to establish a firm foothold. The artificial harbors and massive logistical support ensured the momentum would not be lost as they pushed toward the Rhine. The liberation of France was the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. With the Second Front fully operational, the German army was caught in a giant vice between the advancing Western Allies and the relentless Red Army in the East. The Greatest Crusade, as Eisenhower called it, had succeeded, paving the way for the eventual peace in Europe.